So I just want to quickly start by thanking the conference organizers for the opportunity to speak and acknowledging that I am a settler speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Quinnipiac peoples. And I'll just get started. Suggested personal equipment for Caroline Hinman's 1927 off-the-beaten-track trail riding excursion in the Canadian Rocky Mountains includes a traveling dress or suit for the train, evening wear for the hotel, wool riding breeches, flannel shirts, and buckskin jackets for the trail. A photograph captioned "Busty, ready to start for civilization" captures the gender non-conforming uniform typical of trail riding and the important constructed binary between civilization and wilderness, or train and trail, upheld by the travelers. The photograph is one of over 400 collected by the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library under Adelaide Barthélemy's name, a middle-aged teacher from suburban Illinois who traveled with Hinman between 1923 and 1931. Duplicates of these photos in the Hinman Fawns at the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies and copies sent to Barthelemy from her companions attest to their communal authorship and their import in developing a shared connection and identity among trail riders. Both Busty and an illustrated counterpart on a 1926 trail guide are captured from below in dynamic diagonals that lend a trailblazing attitude to each image. Illustrator Paul Prohl's jaunty woman's red jacket and hat recall those of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who assisted in the management and dispossession of Indigenous peoples from national parks where settler tourists sought the wilderness experience. Hinman's trips, organized between 1915 and 1966, were occasionally co-ed, but catered primarily to young American women. I use the term settler tourist here deliberately because while the women acted as tourists, their leisurely presence was complicit in a larger complex of settler colonial policies that cannot be distilled by national borders. Domestic tourism under settler colonialism is as much about claiming a fixed belonging and asserting a proprietorial right as it is about impermanent experiences. This paper thus tests the question of what is Canadian about Canadian women's art history, the nationality of the artist, the location of production, or does settler colonial art history demand that we question the very definition of North American borders and what is national, for instance, about national parks? What Hinman provided and whose visualization this paper is concerned with was similar to that offered by like-minded organizations like the Trail Riders of the Canadian Rockies, a quote, intimacy with the woods that was feared threatened by modernity. Of course, while Hinman's women presented themselves as so-called new women, they also negotiated the contradictions of anti-modernism, seeking refuge from the ravages of modern life, even as they capitalize on modern shifts in gender norms and expectations. I argued that they accomplished this photographically through the careful staging of their identities, in dialogue with and transit through indigeneity. I use the term transit after Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird, who considers how Indigenous peoples and culture function as a resource through which empire, into which we might add the settler colonial state, create themselves and their subjectivity. Hinman's travelers longed to exhale that they were, in the words of a contemporary trail guide, quote, no longer strange here, meaning in nature, without compromising their power and privilege. In other words, by deploying tools and pictorial conventions used to depict a temporal past for Indigenous peoples, these white women naturalized their own presence in nature as something that appeared established and harmonious. It is a playing Indian, to use Phil Deloria's term, that is not only sartorial, but also a temporal substitution of whiteness as something native to North America, accomplished through pose and the body's inhabited relationship to nature in conjunction with the camera. A group of 3 photos in an archival folder dedicated to Barthélemy's 1924 trip betray the stagecraft and framing devices at play. In the first picture on the left, small birch-like trees dot the grassy foreground, while a painted teepee and a ranch house frame the view. The 2 lodgings enact a confrontation between the land's traditional stewards and the new class of ranchers, settlers, and tourists who descended upon the area following completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885. A second photograph omits the guest ranch. Obliquely positioned, the teepee's entrance at once invites curiosity and dramatizes the potential of a transgression crossing its threshold. A third photograph closes in on the rolling foothills behind and to the left of the teepee, erasing signs of habitation to privilege a view populated by trees. The The isolated teepee thus presents as a mediator between the settler-tourist experience of the commercial ranch house and the pursuit of an intimacy with wilderness. The sequence documents 3 different stages in the interaction with nature and enacts a kind of rite de passage from the still, quote, civilized space of the ranch through the pre-colonial indigenous past to the uninhabited wilderness ideal. With its entrance oriented obliquely towards the viewer, the teepee invites one to pass through the boundary of its imagined pre-colonial indigenous signification to a place, or rather time, where wilderness supposedly awaits in its truest form. Now, although Barthélemy represented herself and her companions rather than an indigenous subject, there is a striking similarity between the typology she photographed and those shot by 20th century anthropologists. In 1899, British anthropologist Alfred Court Haddon offered advice to anthropologists turned photographers. He emphasized the importance of precise photographic staging and cautioned that, quote, many photographers are spoiled by the subject being in an obviously erroneous position or location. Photographers like Edward Curtis adhered closely to this advice, staging their indigenous subjects in settings deemed authentic and that obscured the modern reality of daily lives. The perceived success of the tourist photographs similarly results from such visual precedents. If, for example, the threshold of a teepee was deemed the appropriate location for an indigenous subject, whose assumed intimacy with nature Barthélemy and her companions longed for, then mimicking such a setting authenticated their own presence. Even photographs absent of indigenous signifiers echo Haddon's advice. A picture of campers gathered around a table mid-meal documents what Haddon calls a, quote, unarranged group, taken instantaneously so as to get perfectly natural attitudes. Recognizing the formulaic content of Barthélemy's photos betrays the performative underpinnings of early 20th century wilderness experiences. It also reveals a concerted auto-ethnographic impulse that unites tourist and ethnographic photography. In her study on the rise of the Kodak, Nancy Martha West argues that the company, quote, taught amateur photographers to apprehend their experiences and memories as objects of nostalgia. Such self-nostalgizing is inflected with the desire to salvage one's own authentic experience from the immateriality of memory, and is not dissimilar to the salvage paradigm that captured its subjects in an interminable ethnographic present. While the Barthélemy collection does feature ostentatious examples of indigenous masquerade, as we saw with Caroline Hinman earlier, more seemingly innocuous material signifiers also lurk. In Jane's laundry day, she is surrounded by metal wash bins, happily cleaning clothes in a clearing by a river. Her feet are subtly fur-lined in a pair of moccasins. They stand in as markers for the Stoney, Saulteaux, Cree, and Tunaha, whose own feet were dispossessed from traditional passes and territories, but whose labors continue to tread the land on the feet of tourists like Jane. Laurie Mayer Dries observes that tourists purchased indigenous curios as a means to, quote, authenticate their Banff experience and to bridge the perceived distance between the culture they experienced during their visit and themselves. Hinman's campers used their souvenirs in the site of acquisition, layering on to the objectification of an imagined indigenous past, an embodied touristic present. The camera is an agent of this performative memorialization that relocates the authenticity of an othered culture to oneself. Jane's moccasins are thus located in what Susan Stewart calls an intimate distance that transforms the space and time of an othered indigenous culture into personal space and interiority. Appropriating the clothing of the othered indigenous subject was thus another mechanism through which Barthélemy and her companions materially resolved their detachment from nature. And yet, one might also consider how indigenous peoples collaborated in shaping such objects of settler nostalgia. More than passive producers of objects to be consumed, they also determined the materials available to tourists. Still, these specific artists or individuals are absent from Barthélemy's photographs, despite written evidence of their presence. A fellow camper records an interaction with a group of Stoney Nakota encountered on the way to the Banff Indian Day celebrations. Her journal notes that the 5 indigenous men were, quote, not quite the romantic figures sometimes pictured, but still interesting. They wore old trousers with bright colored shirts, not too clean, a once bright but now faded and soiled kerchief about their necks, end quote. Barthélemy and her companions believed that indigenous authenticity existed firmly in the past rather than present. While this past could be safely accessed by purchasing reproductions of traditional handicrafts and through controlled performances of pre-contact indigeneity, encounters like this one threatened their imaginative construct. The Stony Nakota failed to live up to the photographic antecedents that lived in the tourist's preformed cultural imagination. And rather than document what was perceived to be soiled and faded, they preferred to reconstruct the bright past themselves. Indigeneity was thus most effective as a controlled mediator between settler tourists and the natural environment when it was contained to staged reinterpretations. I'll end with an imagined view of a trail rider's powwow by Paul Prohl, featured in a contemporary trail riding guide, that I think offers a unique and interesting provocation. Like the photographs taken on Hinman's trips, it also invites consideration as a kind of ethnographic spectacle. The presence of the two chief figures on either side of the fold marks a striking difference. Prohl's painting realizes and devotes considerable pictorial real estate to the viewer outside the closed circuit of settler tourist identity construction. What might it mean to consider these chief figures as beholders of an ethnographic gaze, like that more commonly ascribed to white photographers? As static and passive figures, they perform expected tropes of indigeneity, lending authenticity to the trail rider's powwow. But if ascribed the agency of looking, they also lay bare the scene's artificiality. Under the gaze of the indigenous chiefs, carefully staged self-observation by the settler tourist transfigures into true ethnography, the settler subject scrutinized by the indigenous ethnographer. Indeed, the potential of the indigenous gaze undermines the attempt by Hinman's group to eliminate their strangeness in spaces of nature. Conceiving of the photographs as ethnographic curiosities cuts through their performative mundanity and domesticating claims. Subjecting them to the same rigorous critique that ethnographic photography has since undergone reveals a similar agenda in constructing essentialized truths about collective identities, whether those of settler women or indigenous peoples. Acknowledging the gaze of the latter on the former ultimately confounds the women's assumption of a performance with no audience. Thank you.